They say patience is the ultimate power play. For 6 years, I watched my wife mock my financial struggles in front of judges and attorneys, never knowing that every time she stepped into that prestigious corner office, she was walking into a building I owned. Even during our divorce proceedings, she had no idea who really controlled the strings of her success. I sat in the back of the courtroom, my expression carefully neutral, as Katherine, my soon-to-be ex-wife, commanded the space like she owned it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her tailored Chanel suit and perfectly styled auburn hair exuded the confidence of a woman who thought she held all the cards. The irony wasn't lost on me, Your Honor, she began, her voice carrying that practiced tone of legal authority she'd perfected over the years. My husband's consistent pattern of financial irresponsibility has been a strain on our marriage from the beginning. She gestured toward me dismissively, barely sparing a glance in my direction. While I've built a successful career as a senior partner at Morton Pierce, he's jumped from one failed investment to another, draining our joint accounts in the process. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, peered at me over her reading glasses. I could read the judgment in her eyes, another deadbeat husband trying to claim a piece of his successful wife's pie. If only she knew. Katherine's legal team, 3 sharks in expensive suits from her own firm, sat smugly beside her. Thomas Morton himself, the supposed managing partner of Morton Pierce, had made an appearance. He'd always had a soft spot for Katherine, or at least for the millions in billable hours she brought in annually. I thought back to the day I bought Morton Pierce, a strategic acquisition made through one of my holding companies. The firm had been struggling, swimming in debt from overexpansion. It took 3 shell corporations and a labyrinth of paperwork to ensure my name never appeared on any official documents. The art of staying invisible was something I'd mastered long ago. Furthermore, Katherine continued, her voice dripping, with rehearsed concern, Mr. Sullivan's recent attempt to start a tech consulting business ended like all his others, in complete failure. He couldn't even secure a single client. A few chuckles rippled through the gallery, mostly from her colleagues who'd come to witness what they thought would be my humiliation. That failed consulting business was actually my way of auditing potential acquisitions. Every unsuccessful client meeting was a careful evaluation of companies I was considering adding to my portfolio. But Katherine didn't need to know that. Not yet. My attorney, Sarah Martinez, sat quietly beside me. She was one of the few people who knew the truth, chosen specifically for her discretion and her history of representing high-net-worth individuals who preferred to stay out of the spotlight. I'd watched her handle cases for tech billionaires and silent real estate moguls, always keeping their secrets while delivering results. Your Honor, Katherine's voice rose with theatrical conviction. I've supported his entrepreneurial delusions. And for years, I've paid our mortgage, funded his ventures, even covered his car payments when his credit score made it impossible for him to qualify for a loan. More knowing laughs from her colleagues. I glanced at my watch, a modest Timex that cost less than Katherine's weekly coffee budget. The real watches, the ones worth more than most cars, were safely stored away. Everything about my appearance was carefully curated. The slightly outdated suit, the scuffed shoes, the basic smartphone model. Katherine had always been so focused on appearances that she never bothered to look deeper. My mind drifted to the stack of documents waiting in Sarah's briefcase. Ownership records, transfer agreements, bank statements, the paper trail of my empire, hidden in plain sight. Morton Pierce was just one small piece of a much larger puzzle. The failed tech consulting business was actually a front for my investment firm, which controlled over $2 billion in assets through a complex web of subsidiaries and holding companies. The judge's voice snapped me back to the present. Mr. Sullivan, do you have anything to say in response to these allegations? I straightened in my chair, adjusting my slightly crooked tie, a detail Katherine had pointed out with disdain that morning. Your Honor, I believe my attorney has prepared a response to these claims. Sarah nodded, rising slowly from her chair. The documents in her briefcase would change everything. 6 years of careful planning, of building my empire in secret, while Katherine and her legal world dismissed. Me as a failure were about to pay off. I caught Katherine's eye across the courtroom. She gave me that same pitying look she'd worn for years, the one that said she'd married beneath her, that she'd wasted her time on someone who couldn't match her ambition. That look had fueled me. Through countless quiet victories, through acquisitions and mergers that she'd never known about, the corner of my mouth twitched slightly. In less than 5 minutes, Katherine and everyone else in this courtroom would learn the truth. The man they'd mocked, dismissed, and underestimated was about to reveal his cards. And by the time this day was over, Katherine would realize that every step of her successful legal career had been built on a foundation I owned. Sarah opened her briefcase, and I felt the weight of 6 years of patience about to be rewarded. The game was about to change, and I was the only one who knew the real rules. Life hadn't always been this complex dance of hidden power and careful deception. Just last night, I sat in our, soon-to-be-my, penthouse overlooking the city, skyline, watching Katherine prepare for what she thought would be her crowning moment in court. She'd spread her case files across our Italian marble dining table, the one she'd insisted on buying to maintain appearances among her legal circle. "Daniel," she called out, not bothering to look up from her papers. "Make sure you wear that. Navy suit tomorrow, the old one." Her lips curled slightly. "We want to show the judge exactly how much support you've needed over the years." I nodded quietly, sipping my water while scrolling through emails on my budget phone. Meanwhile, my secure tablet, hidden in my private study, was lighting up with notifications about a billion-dollar acquisition I was finalizing. The same acquisition that would soon make Morton Pierce's biggest client completely dependent on my company. Katherine's colleague and closest friend, Victoria Reynolds, sat across from her, both of them surrounded by stacks of legal documents. Victoria was the head of family law at Morton Pierce, known for her ruthless approach to high-profile divorces. The irony of her helping Katherine try to take me for everything I was worth wasn't lost on me. "Honestly, Kat," Victoria said, her voice carrying that distinctive note of upper-class disdain, "I still can't believe you put up with him for so long. 6 years of supporting a wannabe entrepreneur?" She shook her head, diamond earrings catching the light. "You're a saint." Katherine laughed, the sound sharp and practiced. "Well, everyone has their charity cases. Though I have to admit, Daniel's been my least successful pro bono work." More laughter. They didn't even lower their voices, assuming I was too defeated to care about their mockery. I moved to the kitchen, ostensibly to avoid disturbing their preparation. In reality, I needed a moment to appreciate the sheer magnitude of their obliviousness. The kitchen itself was a testament to Katherine's materialistic nature, state-of-the-art appliances she never used, custom cabinetry she bragged about. To her friends, all paid for by the very man she dismissed as a financial failure. "Remember that time he tried to pitch to the venture capital firm?" I heard Victoria ask, her voice carrying easily through the open-plan space. "What was it called again?" "Summit Ventures." "Oh God, yes," Katherine groaned. "He spent weeks preparing. That presentation, really thought he was going to convince them to invest in his revolutionary tech idea." She paused for dramatic effect. They didn't even let him finish the pitch, another detail they'd gotten wrong. That meeting wasn't a pitch. It was a covert evaluation of Summit Ventures itself. 3 months later, I'd acquired the firm through one of my holding companies, though the partners who'd dismissed me still had no idea who their real boss was. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I busied myself making coffee, the expensive Brazilian roast Katherine insisted on buying to impress her guests. Through the kitchen's reflection in the window, I could see them shuffling papers and sharing knowing looks. They were so convinced of their superiority, so certain they knew exactly who and what I was. "Daniel," Katherine called out again. "While you're in there, be a dear and bring us some of that wine, the Bordeaux, if you can manage to identify it." More subtle laughter. "It's the one with the gold label, honey." I grabbed the bottle, a $500 vintage I'd actually selected, though. Katherine believed she'd discovered it at a wine tasting. "Here you go," I said softly, placing it on the table along with 2 glasses. "No glass for yourself?" Victoria asked, her tone dripping with false concern. "Oh, right. Probably best to stay clear-headed for tomorrow. Big day in court, after all." Katherine smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, we wouldn't want anything clouding his judgment. God knows his financial decisions have been questionable enough while sober." I retreated to my designated corner of the living room, the space Katherine had gradually reduced me to occupying as her success at Morton Pierce grew. She'd redecorated the entire penthouse over the years, each new piece of furniture a subtle reminder of her financial dominance in our marriage. The aged leather armchair I sat in was probably the only original piece left, a calculated choice on my part, maintaining the image of someone clinging to past comforts. From my corner, I watched them work late into the night, their confidence growing with each document they reviewed, each strategy they refined. They were building their case on a foundation of assumptions about my finances, my capabilities, my very identity. Tomorrow, that foundation would crumble. "I think we're ready," Katherine finally announced, gathering her papers with an air of finality. "Tomorrow, we'll show everyone exactly who Daniel Sullivan really is." She smiled at Victoria, triumph already gleaming in her eyes. A man who couldn't even maintain his own credit score, trying to claim a piece of my success. If they'd bothered to look closely, they might have noticed the slight smile playing at the corners of my mouth, but they didn't. They never did. Katherine had spent so many years looking down at me that she'd forgotten to look behind the curtain. Victoria gathered her things, sliding them into her premium leather briefcase. Another status symbol in a world built on appearances. "Get some sleep, Kat. Tomorrow's going to be a good day." She turned to me, her smile condescending. "Good luck, Daniel. You'll need it." After Victoria left, Katherine moved around the penthouse with the confidence of someone who believed they owned every inch of space. She didn't know that her name wasn't even on the deed. It was held by one of my shell corporations. The same, one that owned the building itself. "I'm going to bed," she announced, not really speaking to me so much as declaring her movement through her domain. "Try not to stay up all night worrying. What's done is done." I nodded, maintaining the facade of resigned acceptance I'd perfected over the years. "Good night, Katherine." As her footsteps faded down the hallway, I pulled out my basic smartphone, the one she occasionally checked when she thought I wasn't looking. The screen showed nothing but job search websites and rejected application emails. The real work, the empire I'd built while she was busy mocking my failures, was hidden away, waiting for the perfect moment to be revealed. Tomorrow, Katherine would walk into that courtroom believing she was about to cement her victory over me. She had no idea she was actually walking into a carefully laid trap, one that had been 6 years in the making. Every mockery, every dismissal, every condescending smile had been fuel for this moment. I stayed in that leather armchair for a long time, looking out over the city I secretly owned a significant portion of, thinking about how appearance and reality rarely aligned. Katherine and her legal world were about to learn that lesson the hard way. The mockery hadn't started with our divorce proceedings. No, Catherine's disdain had been a carefully cultivated garden of humiliation, growing more elaborate with each passing year. Every success she achieved at Morton Pierce emboldened her, made her more comfortable with her public displays of contempt. I remembered the firm's holiday party last December, a lavish affair held at the Renaissance Hotel's grand ballroom. Katherine had insisted I attend, though not out of any desire for my company. I was her favorite prop, the perfect example of her charitable nature, the successful attorney who'd stuck by her struggling husband. "Daniel," she'd called out across the crowded ballroom, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention. "Come here, darling. Judge Matthews was just asking about your latest venture." I'd made my way through the crowd of legal elites, each of them wearing success like designer labels. Judge Matthews, a distinguished man in his 60s who presided over corporate cases, stood with Katherine and a group of senior partners. The same judge who'd dismissed several cases involving companies I secretly owned. "Ah, yes," Judge Matthews said, swirling his scotch with practiced nonchalance. "Katherine tells me you're exploring some sort of tech enterprise." Before I could respond, Katherine jumped in, her hand resting on my shoulder in a gesture that looked supportive but felt like a collar. "Oh, he's always exploring something, aren't you, dear? Though we've agreed he should stick to smaller investments after the last incident." The incident she referred to was actually a calculated move where I'd appeared to lose $50,000 in a startup investment. In reality, I'd used the opportunity to acquire valuable intellectual property through a shell company, which I later sold for $20 million. But Katherine had spun it into her favorite cautionary tale. Victoria, never far from Katherine's side, chimed in with her practiced concern. "It's so admirable how you keep trying, Daniel. Most men would have given up by now. Most men would have been too proud to accept their wife's support," Thomas Morton added, his position as managing partner making his opinion carry extra weight. "It takes a certain kind of humility." I'd nodded, playing my part perfectly. "I'm very fortunate," I'd said softly, letting them interpret my words however they wanted. The evening had continued like that, a parade of backhanded compliments and thinly veiled insults. Katherine had paraded me around like a case study in perseverance, though not the kind she thought she was showcasing. Each introduction was carefully crafted to highlight the contrast between her success and my apparent failures. "Have you met my husband?" she'd say, before launching into what had become her standard narrative. "He's been trying to break into the tech sector. It's been challenging, but he stays optimistic." What Katherine and her colleagues didn't know was that I owned significant shares in most of their clients' companies. The tech sector she dismissed so easily, I controlled 3 of the largest tech investment funds on the West Coast. Every time they celebrated winning a major client, they were actually celebrating business I had directed their way through my network of corporations. The pressure points weren't just social. Katherine had systematically worked to minimize my role in every aspect of our life together. The penthouse, which I owned through a holding company, had become her territory. She'd relegated my belongings to a small study, the only space she hadn't upgraded with her supposedly superior taste. "Darling," she'd say whenever I spent too much time in the main living areas, "wouldn't you be more comfortable in your study? Victoria and some partners are coming over to discuss the Highwater merger." The Highwater merger, another joke they didn't realize was on them. I was the anonymous buyer they were representing, working through 7 different shell corporations to acquire a major tech conglomerate. They'd spent months preparing their strategy, never knowing that every document they filed, every motion they prepared, was being scrutinized by the very man they dismissed as financially inept. Even in private, Katherine's disdain had become more pronounced. She'd taken to reviewing our finances every month, though she only saw the accounts I allowed her to see. She'd sit at her desk, reading glasses perched on her nose, tisking at what she perceived as my financial mismanagement. "Daniel," she'd say, her voice heavy with practiced patience, "I think we need to discuss your spending. These investment attempts, they're becoming quite costly." I'd sit there playing the part of the chastised husband while my real financial empire grew exponentially. The costly investments she criticized were drops in the ocean of my actual wealth, carefully orchestrated losses designed to maintain my cover. The pressure had mounted gradually, like water wearing away at stone. Every client meeting at Morton Pierce became an opportunity for Katherine to showcase her charitable nature. She'd introduce me to senior partners, judges, and corporate clients with the same careful narrative. The struggling husband. She supported her personal contribution to social responsibility. My wife, the saint, I'd overheard Thomas Morton say at a bar association dinner, supporting him all these years, never complaining. That's real character. If they'd bothered to look closer, they might have noticed things didn't quite add up. The way certain tech companies seemed to choose Morton Pierce right after I'd had failed meetings with them. How their biggest clients were all connected to investment funds that seemed to appear out of nowhere. But they were too busy congratulating themselves on their success to notice who was really pulling the strings. Last week, during a partners meeting I knew about because I owned the firm, Katherine had apparently given quite a performance. According to my sources, she'd turned my latest failed venture into a 20-minute comedy routine, complete with impressions of my excitement over the business plan. "You should have seen him," she'd told her laughing colleagues, "sitting there with his spreadsheets, absolutely convinced this would be the one. Thank God I insisted on separate accounts early on, or we'd be living in a studio apartment." The separate accounts had been my idea, of course. It made it easier to control exactly what Katherine saw of our finances. While she thought she was protecting her assets, she was actually helping me maintain my cover. The pressure points had become more frequent as the divorce proceedings approached. Katherine had started documenting everything, building what she thought was an airtight case for financial support. Every failed investment, every job application, every credit card decline, all carefully orchestrated to create exactly the picture I wanted her to see. "Just wait," she told Victoria over drinks at the penthouse last week, not bothering to lower her voice. "When the judge sees his financial history, it'll be the easiest settlement ever. Poor Daniel won't know what hit him." I'd sat in my usual corner, seemingly absorbed in my phone, while actually reviewing the documents that would soon reveal who really owned Morton Pierce. The pressure wasn't getting to me, it was all part of the plan. Each mockery, each dismissive comment, each condescending smile was just another brick in the foundation of their upcoming downfall. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, all these pressure points would finally serve their purpose. Every humiliation I'd endured was about to transform from a weapon they used against me into evidence of their own blindness. Katherine and her legal world were about to learn that pressure works both ways, and I'd been building up 6 years' worth of it. The true story of my success began long before I met Katherine, though it wasn't the kind of tale that would impress someone so focused on appearances. I wasn't born into privilege or handed opportunities. I built everything from scratch, learning early on that real power often works best from the shadows. My father had been a small-town lawyer in Michigan, the kind who took cases for whatever his clients could afford to pay. He wasn't rich or particularly successful by Katherine's standards, but he taught me something invaluable: the power of understanding systems from the inside out. I watched him navigate the legal world with integrity, even as larger firms swooped in and gradually took over his practice. "Remember, son," he'd told me before he passed, "the loudest voice in the room is often the most desperate to be heard." I took that lesson to heart, but added my own twist. While studying law at night, I spent my days learning about technology and finance. I saw how the digital revolution was changing everything, creating opportunities for those who understood both the technical and legal aspects of business. By the time I finished my law degree, a fact Katherine never knew about, I'd already built my first successful tech company. But I'd also learned another lesson from watching my father's practice crumble. Success made you a target. So, bigger you appeared, the more people tried to take what you had. So I made a choice. I would build my empire in silence, using layers of corporations and holding companies to obscure my involvement. The first acquisition was a small software company in Seattle. I bought it through a shell corporation, turned it around, and sold it for triple the investment. The second was a failing tech startup with valuable patents. Each success taught me more about staying invisible while accumulating power. By the time I met Katherine at that charity gala 6 years ago, I already controlled assets worth over $1 billion. But she saw what I wanted her to see, a modestly successful consultant trying to break into the tech world. Her confidence, her slight condescension, told me everything I needed to know about her character. The purchase of Morton Pierce hadn't been part of my original plan, but watching Katherine parade around the legal world, building her reputation on other people's work while looking down on those she deemed beneath her, made me curious about her firm. A little investigation revealed that the prestigious Morton Pierce was drowning in debt, overextended from rapid expansion and poor management. I remembered the day I closed the deal to buy the firm. I was sitting in my private office. Not the small study in our penthouse, but my real office in a nondescript building across town. Multiple screens showed the final transfers being completed, ownership changing hands through such a complex web of corporations that even the best forensic accountants would struggle to trace it. Sarah Martinez, my longtime attorney and one of the few people who knew the truth, had been there. "Are you sure about this?" she'd asked. "Buying your wife's law firm, it's risky." I'd smiled, thinking about how Katherine had mocked my failed meeting with a tech client that morning. The best moves usually are. The truth was, I didn't just own Morton Pierce. I owned the building they operated from, the software they used for case management, and significant portions of their biggest clients' companies. Every time Katherine bragged about landing a major client, she had no idea she was really just executing my carefully orchestrated plan. My hidden empire extended far beyond the legal world. Through various investment funds and holding companies, I controlled technologies that most of Morton Pierce's clients relied on. The venture capital firm that had rejected my pitch, I bought them 3 months later. The tech startup that Katherine loved to cite as my biggest failure, it was a deliberately orchestrated loss that let me acquire a competing firm at a discount. Every failed business meeting was actually a covert evaluation. While Katherine and her colleagues laughed about my apparent incompetence, I was quietly building one of the largest private technology investment portfolios on the West Coast. The same companies that rejected my pitches would later accept funding from my investment firms, never knowing the connection. My private office, hidden away. On the top floor of an unremarkable building was the command center for this invisible empire. While Katherine thought I was attending job interviews or working on doomed business plans, I was orchestrating mergers and acquisitions worth billions. The room was filled with state-of-the-art technology, multiple screens tracking global markets, and business operations around the clock. The day I decided to buy Morton Pierce, I'd done my homework thoroughly. Thomas Morton, the supposed managing partner, had overextended the firm's resources, trying to expand too quickly. They'd taken on expensive office leases in 3 cities, hired aggressively, and spent lavishly on client entertainment. The firm's debt was hidden from most employees, but I had ways of finding information others couldn't access. Katherine's rapid rise to senior partner hadn't been solely due to her legal skills. I'd quietly directed several major clients to the firm, watching as she took credit for bringing in business that I had essentially handed to her. Every time she boasted about her latest client acquisition, I had to suppress a smile, knowing I was the puppet master behind her success. My network of shell companies and holding corporations was a masterpiece of financial engineering. Each entity was carefully structured to appear independent, with ownership traces leading to dead ends or circular references. The few people who knew the truth, my core team of attorneys and financial advisors, were bound by strict confidentiality agreements and generously compensated for their discretion. Sarah Martinez had been instrumental in building this structure. She understood the value of invisibility in the modern business world. "Your wife's firm," she'd said during one of our private meetings, "they pride themselves on understanding complex corporate structures, yet they've never noticed that half their major clients are connected to your companies." The irony wasn't lost on me. Katherine spent her days navigating corporate law, priding herself on understanding complex business structures, yet she'd never noticed the intricate web that surrounded her own firm. She was so convinced of my financial ineptitude that she never bothered to look closely at the patterns of success that seemed to follow her despite my presence in her life. In my private moments, away from Katherine's disdain and her colleagues' mockery, I continued to expand my empire. Each failed venture she ridiculed was cover for another successful acquisition. While she thought I was fumbling through business proposals in my small study, I was directing a team of brilliant analysts and attorneys, orchestrating deals that would reshape entire industries. The technology that powered Morton Pierce's case management system, owned by one of my companies, the artificial intelligence platform they bragged about using for legal research. I'd acquired the startup that developed it through a series of shell companies. Even the building's maintenance company was owned by one of my holding corporations. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, Katherine and her legal world would finally see the truth. But it wouldn't just be about revealing my ownership of their firm. It would be about showing them how completely they'd underestimated me, how their own arrogance had blinded them to the power structure operating right under their noses. The hidden strength I'd built wasn't just financial. It was the power of being underestimated, of being dismissed as insignificant. While they focused on appearances and status, I'd created something far more substantial, an empire built on silence and strategic patience. The breaking point wasn't a single moment, but rather the culmination of 1,000 small humiliations. Yet there was one evening just 3 weeks before our court date that crystallized everything. It was during Morton Pierce's annual partner retreat, an event Katherine insisted I attend, though not for any pleasant reason. The retreat was held at the Sierra Mountain Lodge, an exclusive resort I happened to own through one of my hospitality investment groups. Katherine, of course, had no idea. She'd spent weeks boasting about how the firm had secured such a prestigious venue, never knowing that her husband had approved the heavily discounted rate they'd been offered. "Daniel," Katherine announced as we entered the grand lobby, her voice carrying that familiar note of controlled disdain. "Why don't you get settled in the room while I attend the opening session? These discussions might be a bit beyond your understanding." The group of partners within earshot exchanged knowing smirks. Victoria, ever present at Katherine's side, added her own barb. "Yes, we wouldn't want to overwhelm you with all our legal jargon. The spa is quite nice, though, perfect for those who need to relax." I nodded quietly, playing my usual role of the docile, unsuccessful husband. What they didn't know was that I had a private meeting room on the top floor, where I would soon be finalizing the acquisition of one of Morton Pierce's biggest clients. a tech company that would soon be redirecting all its legal work to a competing firm I controlled. That evening, during the partner dinner, everything came to a head. Katherine had positioned us at a table with Thomas Morton, Victoria, and several other senior partners. The wine was flowing, an exclusive vintage from my own vineyard in Napa, though they believed it was part of the resort's premium collection. "Tell them about your latest venture, Daniel," Katherine said suddenly, her voice cutting through the dinner conversation. "The one you were so excited about last month. What was it called again? Some sort of app?" I knew what was coming. This was her favorite form of entertainment, using my failures as dinner party ammunition. The app in question was actually a revolutionary piece of legal tech that I'd developed through one of my companies, but I'd allowed Katherine to believe it was just another of my hopeless ideas. "Digital justice," I said softly, maintaining my cover. "It was meant to help streamline legal research." Thomas Morton let out a hearty laugh. "Digital justice? My God, Katherine, how do you maintain your patience? Legal tech from someone who can barely manage his own email account?" The table erupted in laughter. Katherine touched my arm in what appeared to be a gesture of comfort, but I could feel the satisfaction radiating from her. "Well, we all have our crosses to bear," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Though I have to admit, supporting Daniel's adventures has become quite the burden lately." Victoria leaned forward, her expression a mask of concern. "Have you considered having him talk to my brother? He's always looking for good people in his mailroom. Something stable, you know." "The mailroom?" Another partner chimed in. "Isn't that a bit ambitious? Remember when he tried to explain blockchain to Judge Williams at last year's Bar Association dinner?" More laughter. The blockchain discussion they were mocking had actually been a carefully orchestrated conversation. Judge Williams now sat on the board of one of my tech companies, though neither he nor Katherine's colleagues knew who really owned it. Katherine was in her element now, using my presence as a way to highlight her own success. "You know what he said to me last week? He actually suggested that Morton Pierce should consider investing in his latest idea. Can you imagine?" The table collectively cringed, their expressions a mixture of second-hand embarrassment and smug superiority. I took a slow sip of water, thinking about how that latest idea was already being implemented by 3 of the largest law firms in the country, firms I quietly controlled. "Katherine," Thomas Morton said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "I've never said this directly, but I want you to know how much we admire your strength. Lesser attorneys might have let such domestic challenges affect their work, but you've turned it into an inspiration." She preened under the praise, squeezing my hand in what looked like affection but felt like possession. "Well, someone has to be the strong one, right? Though I have to admit the financial burden is becoming significant. Just last month, I had to cover another of his failed investments." That failed investment was actually a strategic loss I'd orchestrated to acquire a competing tech startup at a fraction of its value. The company's patents alone were worth 50 times what Katherine thought I'd lost. But it was what happened next that truly crystallized everything. Katherine, emboldened by the wine and her captive audience, decided to share her plans for after the divorce. "I've already spoken to the best forensic accountants," she announced, earning appreciative nods from her colleagues. "Once we're in court, we'll show exactly how his financial mismanagement has impacted our marriage. The judge needs to understand that I'm not just dealing with incompetence, I'm dealing with active sabotage of our financial future." Victoria raised her glass in a mock toast. To Katherine, too good for too long, but finally taking out the trash. The table laughed, clinking glasses while I sat there, appearing to absorb their mockery with resigned acceptance. But inside, something had shifted. This wasn't just about professional disdain anymore. Katherine was actively planning to paint me as financially abusive in court, to twist my carefully orchestrated appearance of failure into something malicious. "I've already had the locks changed at the penthouse," Katherine continued, not even bothering to lower her voice. "Can't risk him trying to access any sensitive firm documents, though honestly, he probably wouldn't understand them anyway." The irony of her concern about firm documents was almost laughable. I had access to every piece of digital information that passed through Morton Pierce's servers, every email, every client file, every financial record. The very systems they used to store and protect their data were owned by one of my companies. "Smart move," Thomas Morton approved. "Can't be too careful, even with, well, you know." He gestured vaguely in my direction, as if I were a piece of furniture rather than a person. As the evening wore on, their discussion evolved into an open dissection of my perceived failures and Katherine's martyrdom in supporting me. They discussed my future, as if I weren't present, debating whether I'd be able to afford a studio apartment on my own, whether I'd need to move back to my hometown in Michigan. "Maybe this will finally be the wake-up call he needs," Victoria mused, examining me like I was a particularly disappointing science experiment. "Some people have to hit rock bottom before they realize they're not cut out for success." That was the moment, the precise instant when I decided to accelerate my timeline. Watching them plan my financial destruction while sitting in a resort I owned, drinking wine from my vineyard and mocking business failures that were actually calculated successes, I felt a cold clarity descend. I excused myself quietly, citing a headache. Katherine waved me away with barely a glance, already launching into another story about my supposed incompetence. As I walked to the elevator, I could hear their laughter echoing through the lobby. In my private meeting room on the top floor, I made 3 calls. The first was to Sarah Martinez, instructing her to prepare all the documentation for tomorrow instead of waiting for the court date. The second was to my financial team, initiating the final phase of what we'd been preparing for months. The third was to the CEO of Morton Pierce's largest client, confirming our discussion about transferring their business to my other firm. Looking out over the mountain landscape, I felt a sense of absolute certainty. I'd been patient, methodical, willing to endure years of mockery to build something untouchable. But Katherine and her colleagues had just shown me their true faces. The casual cruelty, the absolute conviction in their own superiority, the eagerness to destroy what they didn't understand. Tomorrow they would learn the truth, not just about who owned their firm, but about how completely their own arrogance had blinded them. The breaking point wasn't just about my decision to reveal everything. It was about showing them exactly who they'd been laughing at all these years. After leaving the partner retreat, I spent the night in my real office, not the small study Katherine thought I worked from, but the entire top floor of a downtown high-rise. The space was a testament to everything she thought I couldn't achieve. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, state-of-the-art technology seamlessly integrated into every surface, and a level of sophistication that would have made Morton and Pierce's offices look provincial in comparison. Sarah Martinez arrived just after midnight, carrying the files we'd been preparing for months. Her usual professional demeanor was tinged with anticipation. She'd been one of the few people who'd watched me build this empire from the shadows, who understood exactly what was about to unfold. "Everything's ready," she said, spreading documents across the conference table. "Are you sure you want to move this up? We could stick to the original timeline." I stood at the window, watching the city lights flicker below. In one of those buildings, Katherine was probably still laughing with her colleagues, sharing more stories about her financially inept husband. "No," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "It's time. The documents in front of us told the real story of Morton and Pierce, not the prestigious narrative they presented to the world, but the truth about who really owned the firm and everything connected to it. Through a complex web of holding companies and investment vehicles, I controlled not just their physical assets, but their entire operational infrastructure. "Walk me through it one more time," I said, turning from the window. Sarah nodded, pulling out key documents with practiced efficiency. "First, we reveal your ownership of Morton and Pierce through Apex Holdings," she began, pointing to a complex organizational chart. "That alone will be enough to shock them, but it's just the beginning. Then we show them how their major clients are all connected to your other companies." I examined the chart, tracing the lines of ownership and control. Katherine and her colleagues thought they understood corporate structure. It was their job, after all. But they'd never seen anything like this. Every major client they'd landed in the past 5 years was connected to my companies in some way. Their biggest technological advances, the ones they bragged about at industry conferences, all developed by firms I controlled. "What about the building?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sarah pulled out another document, owned by Summit Real Estate Holdings, which is owned by venture capital partners, which ultimately traces back to you. They've been paying rent to their own boss for years without knowing it. I smiled slightly, remembering how Katherine had bragged about negotiating their lease renewal last year. She'd come home triumphant, celebrating her masterful handling of the negotiations. She had no idea that I'd instructed the property management company to accept her terms before she even made them. And the tech platform they use for case management? Sarah pulled up a detailed report on her tablet. "Legal Tech Solutions, another one of your companies. Every document they've created, every billable hour they've logged, every client communication, it's all been flowing through your servers." The irony was almost poetic. Katherine had spent years dismissing my interest in legal technology, mocking my attempts to understand the intersection of law and tech, all while using systems I'd designed, working in a building I owned, serving clients I controlled. "What about their financial situation?" I asked, moving to the next phase of our plan. Sarah's expression turned serious. "That's where it gets interesting. The firm's recent expansion, the new offices, the aggressive hiring, the lavish client entertainment, it's all been built on debt that you own through various financial institutions." I nodded, remembering Thomas Morton's boasts about the firm's growth. He'd leveraged everything, believing the good times would never end. But every loan, every line of credit had been carefully arranged through banks and investment firms and controlled. And Katherine's personal finances. Sarah pulled out a separate file. "Everything she thinks she owns is actually tied to you. The penthouse, owned by your real estate holding company. Her investment portfolio, managed by your financial firm. Even her car is leased through one of your subsidiaries." I sat down, absorbing the completeness of what we'd built. It wasn't just about owning the firm. It was about showing them how thoroughly they'd failed to see what was right in front of them. Their arrogance, their certainty in their own superiority had made them blind to the true power structure they operated within. "What about the timing tomorrow?" I asked, moving to the practical details. Sarah pulled up a schedule on her tablet. "The divorce hearing is set for 9 a.m. We'll let Katherine make her opening statement, let her lay out her claims about your financial incompetence. Then, when she's finished, we show them everything," I finished. "Not just the firm ownership, but the entire structure. Every connection, every company, every dollar they thought they controlled." "The documentation is overwhelming," Sarah confirmed. "There's no way they can dispute it. The title records, the corporate filings, the banking transactions. It's all there. Once we start, it will take about 20 minutes to completely dismantle everything they thought they knew about their firm and their success." I stood up again, walking back to the window. In the distance, I could see the building that housed Morton and Pierce's offices. Tomorrow, everything they'd built their reputation on would be revealed as an illusion. Their independence, their success, their very understanding of their place in the legal world, all of it would crumble. "Have you considered the aftermath?" Sarah asked carefully. "This won't just affect Katherine. The entire firm will understand exactly who they've been mocking all these years," I finished. "They'll learn that while they were laughing at my failures, I was quietly buying everything they thought they owned." We spent the next few hours going through every detail, every document, every potential question or challenge that might arise. Sarah had been thorough. There were no loose ends, no weaknesses in our strategy. Every claim was backed by irrefutable evidence, every ownership connection documented and verified. "One last thing," Sarah said as she prepared to leave. "I've arranged for additional security at the courthouse tomorrow. Once this comes out—" I nodded, understanding her concern. The revelation wouldn't just be professionally devastating for Katherine and her colleagues. It would be personally humiliating. Years of mockery, of dismissal, of treating me as something less than them, would suddenly be exposed as a massive miscalculation. After Sarah left, I remained in my office, reviewing everything one final time. On one screen, I pulled up the real-time data from Morton Pierce's case management system. I could see Katherine working late, probably putting the finishing touches on her presentation for tomorrow. The same presentation that would never be completed. In another window, I monitored the firm's financial transactions, watching as they continued to operate, completely unaware that every dollar they earned, every client they served, was ultimately connected to me. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that their entire professional world was about to be turned upside down was almost overwhelming. As dawn approached, I changed into a fresh suit, not the shabby one Katherine expected me to wear to court, but a perfectly tailored Tom Ford that cost more than what she thought I made in a year. It was time to step out of the shadows, to finally show them who they'd been dealing with all along. The strategic pause was over. In a few hours, Katherine and her legal world would learn the truth about the man they'd underestimated for so long. And I was ready to watch their carefully constructed reality crumble. The morning of the revelation dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect day that seemed designed for watershed moments. I arrived at the courthouse early, watching from my car as the players in today's drama arrived one by one. The security team I'd positioned, disguised as regular courthouse personnel, kept me updated through my earpiece. "Mrs. Sullivan just arrived with Mr. Morton and the legal team," one of them reported. "They're gathering in the East Conference Room." I smiled slightly, imagining the scene in that room. Katherine would be reviewing her presentation one last time, probably sharing a few more jokes about my financial incompetence with her colleagues. They'd be confident, relaxed, certain of their impending victory. Through the courthouse's security cameras, accessible thanks to a contract with one of my technology companies, I watched them prepare. Katherine was wearing her favorite power suit, the one she reserved for her biggest victories. Victoria stood beside her, both of them surrounded by junior associates who hung on their every word. "We've got eyes on Morton," another security team member reported. "He's on the phone with what appears to be the Shanghai office." The Shanghai office, another piece of their imagined success that I actually controlled. The major Chinese client they'd landed last year had been carefully steered their way through one of my subsidiaries. I checked my watch, a simple Timex that would soon be replaced by the Patek Philippe waiting in my office. 2 hours until the hearing, time to set the final pieces in motion. "Mr. Sullivan," Sarah Martinez's voice came through my earpiece. "The judge's clerk just confirmed receipt of our supplementary filing. Everything's in place." The supplementary filing was a masterpiece of legal documentation. Hundreds of pages of evidence proving my ownership of not just Morton Pierce, but virtually everything and everyone connected to it. We'd timed its submission perfectly. ensuring it would reach the judge just as Katherine was finishing her opening statement. I stepped out of my car, straightening my intentionally shabby suit. One last performance as the struggling husband before the truth came out. Through the courthouse windows, I could see Katherine and her team moving toward the courtroom, their expressions confident and slightly amused as they spotted me. "Daniel," Katherine called out, her voice carrying that familiar note of condescension. "I'm surprised you're early. Usually you can barely manage to be on time for anything." Victoria smirked beside her. "Must be excited to hear about all his financial failures laid out in official court records." I gave them my practiced look of resigned acceptance, just trying to be respectful of the court's time. Thomas Morton, who joined them, laughed heartily. "Well, that's a first. Though I suppose when you have as much experience with failure as you do, you learn to face it efficiently." They swept past me into the courtroom, their designer suits and expensive briefcases marking them as the successful ones, the winners in life's game. If they'd bothered to look closely, they might have noticed the slight smile playing at the corners of my mouth. In the courtroom, I took my place beside Sarah, watching as Katherine's team arranged themselves with practiced precision. They had no idea that every move they made, every document they prepared to present, was being monitored through systems I controlled. "Your Honor," Katherine's voice rang out clearly as the judge entered. "Before we begin, I'd like to note for the record that my husband's repeated financial failures have made this divorce proceeding necessary. We have extensive documentation of his mismanagement and failed ventures." The judge nodded, glancing at me with that same look of slight disdain I'd grown so accustomed to. "Proceed, Mrs. Sullivan." Katherine stood, smoothing her skirt with the confidence of someone who believed they held all the cards. "As you'll see in Exhibit A, my husband's pattern of financial irresponsibility began almost immediately after our marriage. I listened quietly as she detailed my supposed failures, each one actually a carefully orchestrated move in a game she didn't know she was playing. The failed tech startup, now worth billions under a different name. The rejected investment opportunities, all acquired through my holding companies at a fraction of their value. Thomas Morton nodded approvingly as Katherine presented their carefully prepared evidence. The senior partners from Morton Pierce, who'd come to witness my humiliation, sat in the gallery, their expressions a mixture of sympathy for Katherine and barely concealed disdain for me. Through my earpiece, I could hear my team's final confirmations. The documents were ready. The digital presentations were queued up. Every piece of evidence that would shatter their world was in place, waiting for the perfect moment. Katherine was in her element now, her voice rising and falling with practiced emotion as she described the burden of supporting a financially irresponsible husband. "Your Honor, over the past 6 years, I've had to watch as my husband squandered opportunity after opportunity. While I built a successful career at Morton Pierce, I glanced at Sarah, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod. The time was approaching. In the gallery, I could see Victoria whispering to another partner, probably sharing another joke at my expense. Thomas Morton sat with his usual air of superiority, periodically checking his phone, probably monitoring the Shanghai deal that I actually controlled. The anticipation had built to a perfect crescendo. Katherine was just reaching the culmination of her presentation, her voice filled with righteous indignation. "And so, Your Honor, given this clear pattern of financial mismanagement and the burden it has placed on our marriage, I am asking the court to—" Sarah's hand moved toward her briefcase, where the documents that would change everything waited. Through the courthouse's sound system, installed by another company I owned, I could hear Katherine's voice clearly as she prepared to deliver what she thought would be the final blow to my reputation. The moment was exquisite. "Katherine, and her legal team at the height of their confidence, the judge looking down at me with professional disapproval, the gallery full of Morton and Pierce partners eager to witness my humiliation. None of them had any idea that in less than 5 minutes, their entire understanding of the past 6 years would be completely upended. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The anticipation wasn't anxiety. It was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that years of careful planning were about to pay off. Every mockery, every dismissive comment, every condescending smile had led to this moment. Katherine turned to face me, her expression a perfect mixture of pity and contempt. "Your Honor, my husband's financial incompetence speaks for itself. The evidence we've presented clearly shows." It was time. I nodded to Sarah, and she began to remove the documents from her briefcase. The revelation was about to begin, and the anticipation of the past 6 years was about to transform into something far more satisfying. Justice. "Your Honor." Sarah Martinez's voice cut through Katherine's monologue with surgical precision. "Before my client's wife continues, we'd like to submit some supplementary evidence that directly pertains to these financial claims." Katherine's expression flickered, a momentary break in her practiced composure. She wasn't used to being interrupted, especially not during what she thought would be her moment of triumph. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We weren't notified of any additional submissions." The judge looked at Sarah, then at me, her expression questioning. "Counselor, explain the relevance of this last-minute evidence." Sarah rose slowly, every movement deliberate. "Your Honor, Mrs. Sullivan has made numerous claims about my client's financial status and business acumen. This evidence directly addresses those claims and provides crucial context about the true nature of their financial relationship." I watched Katherine's face carefully as Sarah approached the bench with our first set of documents. The slight smirk she'd worn throughout the proceedings was still there, but something uncertain flickered behind her eyes. Perhaps some long-dormant instinct was warning her that something wasn't quite right. "If you'll examine Exhibit A," Sarah continued, her voice steady, "you'll find the complete ownership records for Morton and Pierce law firm." Thomas Morton straightened in his seat, his usual air of superiority giving way to confusion. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand froze halfway to her water glass. Katherine's smirk faltered slightly. "As you can see," Sarah proceeded, "the firm was acquired 3 years ago by Apex Holdings, which is owned by Summit Ventures, which in turn is controlled by—" She paused for effect. "Daniel Sullivan." The silence that fell over the courtroom was absolute. Katherine's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. Thomas Morton's face had gone pale, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as if for support. That's impossible," Katherine finally managed, her voice having lost its practiced authority. "Morton and Pierce is a partnership. We would know if—" Sarah was already moving, placing another document before the judge. "Exhibit B shows the complete chain of ownership, including all shell corporations and holding companies. Mr. Sullivan's acquisition was conducted through a complex but entirely legal series of transactions, all properly documented and filed." The judge was examining the documents with increasing interest, her earlier dismissive attitude toward me completely gone. "These appear to be in order," she said, looking up at Katherine and her team. "Did none of you know about this?" Victoria had found her voice, though it trembled slightly. "Your Honor, this has to be some kind of mistake. I've personally handled the firm's corporate documents." "The documents you had access to," I spoke for the first time, my voice calm and clear, "were exactly what I wanted you to see." All eyes turned to me as I stood, shrugging off the carefully cultivated appearance of the failing husband. Katherine, Did you never wonder how Morton Pierce suddenly landed those major tech clients right after my failed meetings with them? Or how the firm could afford that state-of-the-art case management system right after you mocked my interest in legal technology? Sarah was already presenting more evidence. Exhibit C shows Mr. Sullivan's ownership of the building Morton Pierce occupies. Exhibit D details his controlling interest in the firm's major clients. Exhibit E demonstrates his ownership of the technology platforms the firm relies on. Katherine's face had gone from pale to ashen. The building, the clients, the technology. She turned to Thomas Morton, who looked like he might be ill. "Thomas, is this true?" But Thomas Morton was staring at another document Sarah had just handed him, the one showing that the loans he'd taken out to finance the firm's expansion were all held by financial institutions I controlled. "Every success you've mocked," I continued, my voice level but carrying easily through the stunned silence. "Every venture you dismissed, every meeting you thought I failed at, they were all part of building this. While you were busy laughing at my supposed incompetence, I was quietly buying everything around you." Victoria's carefully maintained composure had completely crumbled. "The Shanghai office," she whispered. "The new Asian clients, all connected to my companies," I confirmed. "Every major client you thought you landed through your legal brilliance was actually directed to the firm through my business network." Sarah was methodically laying out more evidence. Exhibit F shows Mr. Sullivan's ownership of the resort where the firm just held its partner retreat. Exhibit G details his controlling interest in the tech startup that developed the firm's artificial intelligence legal research platform. Katherine had slumped back in her chair, her expression a mixture of shock and dawning horror. "The penthouse," she said quietly. "Tell me I at least own the penthouse." "Owned by Summit Real Estate Holdings," Sarah replied professionally, "a subsidiary of Mr. Sullivan's primary holding company." The gallery had erupted into whispered conversations. The Morton Pierce partners who had come to witness my humiliation were now facing their own. Years of mockery, of dismissive attitudes, of treating me like some kind of cautionary tale. It was all unraveling before their eyes. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the chaos, "given these revelations, we'd like to address Mrs. Sullivan's claims about financial support and marital assets." The judge, who had been reading through the documents with increasing attention, nodded. "I think that would be appropriate, Counselor." I stayed standing, watching as Katherine's world continued to crumble around her. The designer purse she carried, purchased with funds from an account I controlled. The luxury car she drove to court, leased through one of my companies. Even her prestigious corner office at Morton Pierce, space she'd occupied in a building I owned. "For 6 years," I said, addressing not just Katherine but the entire courtroom, "you've all treated me like a failure. A joke, something to be pitied or mocked. You never thought to look deeper, to question whether there might be more to the story. Your own arrogance blinded you to what was happening right in front of you." Thomas Morton had found his voice, though. It was barely a whisper. "The expansion plans, the new offices we were planning, will not be proceeding," I finished for him. "At least not under current management." The implications of what was happening were finally starting to sink in. They weren't just facing the revelation that I owned their firm. They were realizing that their entire professional world, everything they'd prided themselves on, had been secretly controlled by the very man they'd spent years mocking. Katherine stood suddenly, her legs shaking slightly. "Daniel," she started, her voice attempting to find its usual authority and failing completely. Why let me believe, let all of us believe?" "Because you showed me who you really were," I replied simply. "Every mockery, every dismissal, every time you used me as a punchline at your firm parties, you revealed your true character. And in doing so, you gave me the perfect cover to build something you never thought I was capable of." Sarah was still methodically presenting evidence, each document another nail in the coffin of their presumptions. The judge had completely abandoned any pretense of dismissiveness toward me, now examining each piece of evidence with keen interest. "Your Honor," Sarah concluded, "given these revelations, we move to dismiss Mrs. Sullivan's claims regarding financial support. Furthermore, we have additional motions regarding the restructuring of Morton and Pierce's management team." The courtroom had descended into chaos, but a controlled chaos. Katherine's legal team was frantically whispering among themselves, desperately seeking some way to challenge what they were seeing. The Morton and Pierce partners in the gallery were pale-faced, the full implications of their situation becoming clear, and Katherine, my soon-to-be ex-wife, who had built her identity around being the successful one in our marriage, sat in stunned silence, her perfect world shattered by the truth she'd been too arrogant to see. The judge called for a 30-minute recess to review the mountain of evidence we'd presented. As the gallery erupted into frenzied whispers, I remained perfectly still, watching the carefully constructed world of Morton and Pierce crumble around me. Katherine sat frozen in her chair, her usual poise shattered, while her colleagues huddled in corners, their faces masks of panic and disbelief. "This is impossible," Thomas Morton muttered, repeatedly shuffling through the documents we'd provided. "The firm, the building, our clients." His hands were shaking, the papers rattling slightly as he read and reread the evidence of his own blindness. Victoria, who had spent years perfecting the art of condescension towards me, now couldn't even meet my eyes. She stood awkwardly by Katherine's side, her usual confidence replaced by a nervous energy that made her seem smaller somehow. "Mr. Sullivan," Sarah spoke quietly beside me, "the managing partners are requesting an immediate meeting." I nodded, standing slowly. "Let's use the judge's chambers. I'm sure Her Honor won't mind, considering I own the courthouse's maintenance contract." More shocked murmurs rippled through the room. Every revelation seemed to add another layer to their humiliation, another reminder of how completely they'd underestimated me. Katherine finally found her voice as I moved toward the door. "Daniel, wait!" She hurried after me, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. "We need to talk about this. You can't just—" I turned to face her, and something in my expression made her step back. "Can't what, Katherine? Can't own the firm you're so proud of? Can't control the business you thought was yours? Can't reveal that your successful career was built on foundations I created, but all those failed ventures," she stammered. "The meetings, the rejections, the losses were exactly what I wanted you to see," I finished. "Every failure you mocked was actually a success you were too arrogant to recognize. Remember that tech startup you loved telling everyone about? The one that couldn't even get a meeting with major investors?" She nodded numbly. "I own it now. Bought it through a shell corporation for a fraction of its value. It's worth 9 figures. I stepped closer, my voice low but clear. "Every time you shared that story at dinner parties, laughing about my incompetence, you were actually broadcasting your own ignorance." Thomas Morton had approached, his face ashen. "The Shanghai deal is already dead," I confirmed. "I've instructed the client to move their business to another firm, one that, coincidentally, I also own." The color drained from his face completely. "But that deal, it was worth millions?" "Yes, I know. I'm the one who directed it to Morton and Pierce in the first place." I turned to address the growing crowd of partners gathering around us. "Everything you thought you built, every client you landed, every deal you closed, every success you celebrated was orchestrated by the man you spent years mocking." Victoria stepped forward, her usual sophistication replaced by barely concealed panic. "The firm's expansion plans are cancelled," I cut in, "along with your position as head of family law. Though I suspect you'll have plenty of time to work on your own legal troubles soon. Those harassment complaints you helped cover up, They're being reinstated. The blood drained from her face. You know about those? I know everything, I said simply. Every email, every file, every conversation you thought was private. It all passed through systems I control. Your attempts to silence junior associates, your manipulation of evidence, your backroom deals. It's all documented. Katherine had started to cry, her perfect makeup running slightly. Why, she whispered, why let me believe you were a failure all these years? Why endure the mockery, the jokes, the humiliation? I finished for her. Because you showed me exactly who you were, Katherine. Not just you, but everyone in your world. Your contempt, your arrogance, your absolute certainty in your own superiority. It made you blind, and that blindness made you perfect targets. The judges' chambers were larger than usual, but they felt cramped with the entire senior partnership of Morton and Pierce crowded inside. These men and women, who had spent years looking down on me, now stood like chastened schoolchildren as I took the judge's seat. Let me be clear about what happens next, I began, my voice calm but carrying authority they'd never heard from me before. Morton and Pierce will undergo a complete restructuring. Most of you in this room will be finding new employment, though. Your options may be limited once the ethics investigations are complete. Ethics investigations. Thomas Morton's voice cracked slightly. Yes, I confirmed. Every case of overbilling, every instance of evidence manipulation, every ethical breach you thought was safely hidden, it's all coming to light. Did you really think those internal systems you used to track billable hours weren't monitoring everything else as well? The room erupted in panicked whispers. These proud attorneys, who had built their reputations on appearing invincible, were crumbling before my eyes. The firm's clients, someone began. Are mine, I finished. They always were. Every major client you thought you landed through your legal brilliance was actually directed to Morton and Pierce through my business network, and now they'll be directed elsewhere. Katherine had moved to a corner of the room, her body language completely transformed. Gone was the confident, successful attorney who had dominated our marriage. In her place sat a woman beginning to realize that her entire professional identity had been built on an illusion. The partner's equity, Thomas Morton tried again, is worthless, I cut in. The firm's real value isn't in its name or its client list. It's in the infrastructure I built around it. The technology, the systems, the client relationships, all of that belongs to me. What's left is just a handful of attorneys who were too arrogant to notice they were working for the man they mocked. Victoria had started to cry silently, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking completely. My cases, my clients will be reassigned, I said firmly. Though given the evidence of ethical violations in your case files, I suspect your legal career may be coming to an end anyway. The reality of their situation was finally starting to sink in. These proud, successful attorneys, who had spent years building their reputations and careers, were suddenly realizing that everything they thought they'd achieved had been controlled by the very person they'd dismissed as a failure. As for you, Katherine, I turned to my soon-to-be ex-wife, I think we can agree that your claims about supporting me financially have been thoroughly disproven. The divorce settlement will reflect the reality of our situation, not the fantasy. You presented to the court. She looked up, her eyes red but suddenly calculating. I'm still your wife. I have rights. You have nothing, I corrected her gently. Everything you thought you owned, the penthouse, the car, your investment portfolio, it's all controlled by my companies. Even your personal bank accounts are with a bank I acquired last year. You've been living off my generosity while mocking me for being financially irresponsible. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. For years, they had laughed at my supposed failures, dismissed my business attempts, treated me as someone to be pitied or scorned. Now, they were realizing that every aspect of their professional lives had been under my control. The hearing will resume in 10 minutes, I announced, standing. I suggest you all use that time to consider your options carefully, though to be honest, your options are rather limited at this point. As I walked out of the chambers, leaving behind the stunned remnants of Morton and Pierce's leadership, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. 6 years of careful planning, of enduring their mockery while building my empire in secret, had finally paid off. The reckoning wasn't just about revealing my ownership of their firm, it was about showing them the true cost of their arrogance. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The gallery, once filled with smirking, Morton and Pierce partners eager to witness my humiliation, now sat in stunned silence. Katherine's usual commanding presence had crumbled, replaced by a woman who seemed to have aged years in the span of an hour. The judge cleared her throat, shuffling the documents before her with newfound respect in my direction. Given the evidence presented, this court finds Mrs. Sullivan's claims regarding financial support to be without merit. Furthermore, she paused, looking directly at Katherine and her legal team. I am referring several matters raised in these documents to the State Bar Association for Ethics Review. Thomas Morton, who had practically collapsed into his chair, barely reacted to the news. His empire, or what he had thought was his empire, was crumbling around him in real time. Through the courthouse's security feeds, I could already see reporters gathering outside, drawn by whispers of the dramatic revelations unfolding within. Your Honor, Sarah Martinez stood, her posture perfect as always. We have prepared a complete divorce settlement agreement that accurately reflects the true financial situation between the parties. Katherine's new reality was hitting her in waves. As Sarah distributed copies of the settlement, I watched my wife's face contort as she read through the details. Every asset she had thought was hers, from the penthouse to her investment portfolio, was listed as my property. Her entire financial world, built on the illusion of her own success, was dissolving before her eyes. This is... Katherine started, her voice barely a whisper. This is everything. I'll have nothing. Not nothing, I corrected her, speaking for the first time since the recess. You'll have exactly what you earned on your own merit, without my hidden support. Consider it a fresh start. Isn't that what you wanted? Victoria, still shell-shocked from the revelations about her ethical violations, placed a trembling hand on Katherine's shoulder. But Katherine shrugged it off, suddenly aware that her supposedly loyal friend had been just as blind, just as arrogant, just as complicit in years of mockery. The judge was still speaking, outlining the terms of the divorce settlement, but the real action was unfolding in the gallery. Partners were frantically checking their phones, watching as news of Morton and Pierce's true ownership spread through the legal community. Their professional reputations, built on the illusion of independent success, were evaporating in real time. Mr. Sullivan, the judge addressed me directly, regarding the restructuring of Morton and Pierce. My team will handle the transition, I assured her, though I suspect the firm's name will need to change, given recent revelations. Thomas Morton made a sound like he'd been punched in the gut. The firm had borne his name for 30 years, though for the last 3, he'd unknowingly been nothing more than an employee in my larger organization. Sarah's tablet discreetly displayed updates from our team at Morton and Pierce's offices. The news was spreading quickly through the firm's ranks. Junior associates who had endured years of abuse from Victoria and others were already coming forward with their stories. The Human Resources Department, which had helped cover up numerous ethical violations, was in complete chaos. Your Honor, Katherine tried one last time, her voice cracking. Surely the court can see that this was all a deliberate deception. He manipulated me, made me believe... Made you believe what, Katherine? I interrupted calmly. Made you believe I was someone you could mock, someone you could parade around as an example of failure, someone you could use to make yourself feel superior? I stood, addressing not just her but the entire room. You created that narrative yourself. Your own arrogance, your need to feel superior, that's what blinded you to the truth. The judge nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her eyes. She had seen countless divorce cases, but nothing quite like this. Mrs. Sullivan, the court cannot protect you from the consequences of your own assumptions and actions. Through my earpiece, I received updates about the scene unfolding at Morton Pierce's offices. The firm's biggest clients were already calling, demanding explanations. The carefully cultivated image of legal excellence was shattering as the truth emerged about who really controlled their success. "The Shanghai deal is officially dead," Sarah whispered, showing me the confirmation on her tablet. "Our team has already redirected the client to our other firm." Thomas Morton, overhearing this, seemed to physically deflate. That deal had been set to save the firm from its mounting debt I had secretly acquired through various financial institutions. Now, like everything else he had thought he controlled, it was slipping through his fingers. Katherine was still staring at the settlement papers, her hands shaking slightly. The penthouse she had decorated so carefully, the car she had chosen to project success, the investment portfolio she had bragged about at dinner parties, all of it had been an illusion, controlled by the very man she had spent years mocking. "There. It's one more matter," Sarah announced, producing another set of documents. "Given the evidence of widespread ethical violations at Morton Pierce, we are initiating proceedings to report several members of the firm to the Bar Association." Victoria's perfectly manicured nails dug into the arm of her chair. The harassment, complaints she'd helped bury, the evidence she had helped manipulate, it was all coming back to haunt her. Her career, built on intimidation and ethical compromises, was about to face its own reckoning. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, "Mr. Sullivan's technology companies have archived every communication, every file, every transaction conducted through the firm's systems. The evidence of misconduct is extensive and irrefutable." The judge's expression hardened as she reviewed the new documents. "This court will cooperate fully with any ethics investigations, and may I say," she added, looking directly at Katherine, "and her colleagues, that in 20 years on the bench I have rarely seen such a comprehensive unraveling of professional misconduct." Katherine had finally run out of words. The polished, confident attorney who had walked into court expecting to humiliate her husband was gone, replaced by someone who was just beginning to understand the magnitude of her miscalculation. As the hearing concluded, I watched the immediate impact of my revelation ripple through the legal community. Morton Pierce's reputation, built over decades, was crumbling in a matter of hours. The partners who had laughed at my supposed failures were now facing their own professional extinction, but perhaps the most profound impact was visible in Katherine's eyes as she finally looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. The carefully constructed facade of superiority had shattered, revealing the truth she had been too arrogant to see, that the man she had dismissed as a failure had orchestrated the most complete professional dismantling she had ever witnessed. In the days following the courthouse revelation, the full impact of what I'd done began to ripple through the legal community like shockwaves from an earthquake. Morton Pierce, once a symbol of legal prestige, had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of arrogance and assumption. The lessons being learned weren't just about money or power. They were about the fundamental way people choose to see the world and treat others. I sat in my real office, the one Katherine had never known about, watching multiple screens display the aftermath of my revelation. News coverage played silently on one monitor, showing reporters camped outside the Morton Pierce building. Another screen showed real-time updates from the firm's internal communications, where panic had given way to a kind of stunned resignation. Sarah Martinez entered, carrying her tablet with the latest updates. "The Bar Association has opened formal investigations into 15 partners," she reported. "Victoria's ethical violations alone fill 300 pages." I nodded, thinking about how Victoria had been one of the most vocal critics of my supposed failures. Now, her own career was ending in genuine failure, brought down by the very evidence she thought she had safely hidden in the firm's secure systems I had built and controlled. "And Katherine?" I asked, though I already knew the answer through my various monitoring systems. "She hasn't left her sister's house since the hearing," Sarah replied. "The prenup has been validated by 3 separate judges. She's lost everything: the penthouse, the cars, the investment accounts. Her legal career is essentially over, given her association with the firm's ethical violations." The lesson hadn't been lost on the legal community. Across the city, law firms were suddenly scrutinizing their own practices, their own assumptions, their own ways of treating others. The mighty had fallen, and everyone was wondering if they might be next. Thomas Morton had already announced his retirement, though it was more of a surrender than a choice. The firm that bore his name was being systematically dismantled, its clients redistributed among my other legal enterprises, its assets absorbed into my larger organization. The empire he thought he'd built had turned out to be a castle made of sand, washed away by the tide of truth. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling up another document on her tablet. "We've been receiving messages from junior associates and support staff at Morton Pierce. The stories they're sharing about how they were treated, it's worse than we thought." I leaned back in my chair, remembering how Katherine and her circle had treated those they considered beneath them. The mockery hadn't been reserved just for me. It had been a systematic pattern of behavior, a culture of contempt that had infected every level of the firm. "Make sure they're taken care of," I instructed. "The ones who were silenced, intimidated, held back. I want them to have opportunities at our other firms. Real opportunities, based on merit rather than connections or appearances." The wisdom gained from this experience wasn't just about the power of patience or the satisfaction of revenge. It was about understanding how success and power can corrupt, how people can become so convinced of their own superiority that they lose touch with basic human decency. Through the window of my office, I could see the building that had housed Morton Pierce. The prestigious corner offices where Katherine and her colleagues had plotted their legal strategies, mocked their perceived inferiors, and celebrated their illusory successes. All of it would soon be transformed into something else entirely. "The Shanghai clients called again," Sarah mentioned. "They're impressed with how we handled the transition. They want to expand their relationship with our other firms." I smiled slightly, remembering how Katherine had bragged about landing the Shanghai deal, how she had used it as another example of her superior business acumen. She never knew that every major client she thought she'd attracted had been carefully guided there through my network of businesses and connections. The wisdom wasn't in the victory itself, but in understanding why it had been possible in the first place. Katherine and her colleagues had been so convinced of their own narrative, the successful attorneys looking down on the struggling husband, that they had failed to see the reality right in front of them. "Mr. Sullivan," Sarah said, her voice taking on a more personal tone, "having watched this unfold from the beginning, I have to ask, was it worth it? The years of pretending, enduring their mockery, living a double life?" I thought about the question carefully. The easy answer would have been yes, given the completeness of my victory, but the truth was more complex. The experience had taught me something profound about human nature, about the masks people wear and the stories they tell themselves. "It was never about the money or even the power," I replied finally. "It was about exposing a certain kind of Toxic arrogance that infects people when they think they're untouchable. Katherine and her colleagues didn't just mock me. They created a culture where success justified cruelty, where status meant you could treat others as less than human. On one of the monitors, I could see Katherine's former office being cleared out. The designer furniture she had chosen to project power, the awards she had displayed so prominently, the view she had used to intimidate clients and colleagues, all of it was being dismantled. The lesson, I continued, isn't just that they underestimated me, it's that they overestimated themselves. They thought their law degrees, their prestigious firm, their social connections made them superior. They never understood that real power isn't about what you display, it's about what you build. Sarah nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. She had been one of the few who had known the truth from the beginning, who had helped me construct this elaborate revelation. But even she was still processing the deeper implications of what we had accomplished. The firm's ethical violations, she said, reviewing another document, they weren't just isolated incidents, were they? They were symptoms of something deeper. They were symptoms of a belief system, I confirmed, a system that said if you had enough power, enough status, enough success, you could treat others however you wanted. Katherine didn't just mock me because she thought I was a failure. She did it because she thought her success gave her the right to be cruel. The wisdom gained wasn't just personal. It was a lesson for the entire legal community. The fall of Morton and Pierce had become a watershed moment, forcing people to examine their own assumptions, their own treatment of others, their own definitions of success. "What happens next?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. "We rebuild," I said simply, "not just the firm but the entire culture. The new Morton and Pierce, or whatever we decide to call it, will be built on merit, on genuine excellence, on treating every person with respect, regardless of their position or status." The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows through the office windows. Somewhere out there, Katherine was confronting the reality of her new situation, learning the hard way that success built on arrogance is no success at all. The wisdom she was gaining, though painful, was perhaps the most valuable lesson of all. 6 months after the courthouse revelation, I stood in the newly renovated lobby of what had once been Morton and Pierce. The prestigious law firm's name had been replaced with Summit Legal Partners, a simple yet powerful reminder of the transformation that had taken place. The marble floors still gleamed, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Gone was the suffocating air of arrogance, replaced by an environment of genuine professional excellence. The transformation hadn't just been physical. In the months following the revelation, the legal community had undergone a seismic shift. The fall of Morton and Pierce had become a watershed moment, forcing law firms across the city to re-examine their cultures, their practices, and their treatment of others. Sarah Martinez, now the managing partner of Summit Legal, approached with her tablet displaying the latest quarterly reports. "The numbers are impressive," she said, "but it's the cultural changes that are really remarkable." I nodded, scanning the data. The firm's billable hours were actually higher than they'd ever been under the old regime, but now they represented genuine work, rather than the padded invoices and ethical shortcuts that had characterized Morton and Pierce's practice. "What about the former junior associates?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from my monitoring systems. "Thriving," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "Jennifer Chen, the one Victoria used to torment. She just won the Anderson case. The one Victoria claimed was too complex for anyone but senior partners to handle." The transformation had been most visible in the careers of those who had been suppressed under the old system. People who had been mocked, dismissed or held back because they didn't fit the Morton and Pierce mold of success were now rising based on their actual abilities. Katherine, I had heard, had left the city entirely. The last reports showed her working at a small legal aid clinic in Michigan, ironically not far from where my father had practiced. The woman who had once mocked others for their perceived failures was learning about real legal work, about helping people who needed it rather than just chasing prestige. Victoria's ethical violations had resulted in a 5-year suspension from practicing law. Thomas Morton had retired to Florida, his reputation in tatters. The other partners, who had participated in the culture of mockery and ethical shortcuts, had scattered to various smaller firms, their dreams of legal stardom permanently dimmed. The Shanghai clients are here for their quarterly review, Sarah mentioned. They've brought 3 new companies with them, all interested in our services. I smiled slightly, remembering how Katherine and her colleagues had celebrated landing the Shanghai deal, never knowing it had been orchestrated through my business network. Now, those same clients were bringing in more business, attracted by the firm's new reputation for ethical excellence rather than just prestigious posturing. The transformation wasn't just about success, it was about redefining what success meant. The new Summit legal partners operated on principles that would have been alien to Morton Pierce: merit-based advancement, ethical practice, genuine client service, and respect for every member of the team regardless of their position. "Mr. Sullivan," a voice called out. I turned to see James Wilson, a former mailroom employee who had been treated as invisible by Katherine and her circle. Now he was heading our new legal technology division, his innovative ideas finally finding an audience that could appreciate them. "The new case management system is ready to roll out," James reported, his confidence a far cry from the hesitant demeanor he'd shown under the old regime. "It's already generating interest from other firms." The transformation had rippled beyond our own walls. Law firms across the city had watched the fall of Morton Pierce and the rise of Summit legal partners with intense interest. Many had begun their own internal reviews, desperate to avoid a similar fate. "The Bar Association called again," Sarah mentioned as we walked through the office floors. "They want you to speak at their annual ethics conference. Your revelation about Morton Pierce has made legal ethics a hot topic." I shook my head slightly. "The story speaks for itself. They don't need me to explain why treating people with contempt while hiding behind a facade of success is wrong." The physical transformation of the office space reflected the deeper changes. The intimidating corner offices that had once symbolized power had been replaced with collaborative workspaces. The firm's art collection, chosen by Katherine for its price tags rather than its meaning, had been donated to local museums, replaced with works by emerging artists. "The pro bono program is expanding," Sarah continued, pulling up another report. "We're taking on cases that Morton Pierce would have dismissed as beneath them. Last month alone, we helped 30 families avoid eviction. The transformation had touched every aspect of the firm's practice. The resources that had once been spent on maintaining an image of prestige were now directed toward making a real difference in people's lives." I paused by what had once been Katherine's office. The space had been converted into a training center, where new associates learned not just legal practice, but ethical decision-making and professional responsibility. The view she had used to intimidate others now served as inspiration for those learning to practice law the right way. "Sometimes," Sarah said thoughtfully, "I wonder if Katherine and the others ever truly understood what happened. Not just the revelation about your ownership, but the deeper lesson about how they chose to treat others." I thought about the reports I still received about my ex-wife's activities. The legal aid work she was doing in Michigan wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Perhaps that was its own kind of transformation. "They understood power," I replied, "but only one kind, the power to make others feel small. They never grasped that real strength comes from lifting people up, not pushing them down." The day wound down, and I watched from my office as the sun set over the city. The lights of Summit Legal Partners glowed warmly, a beacon of the transformation that had taken place. The firm that had once been a symbol of legal arrogance had become something else entirely, a place where excellence and ethics went hand in hand. The transformation wasn't just about changing a law firm or exposing the hollowness of false success. It was about showing that there's a better way to build something lasting. Through respect, through genuine merit, through understanding that every person has value regardless of their title or position. As I prepared to leave for the day, I passed the firm's new mission statement, prominently displayed in the lobby: justice through excellence, success through integrity. Simple words, but they represented everything that Morton Pierce had failed to understand, and everything that Summit Legal Partners strived to be. The transformation was complete, but in many ways, it was just the beginning. The story of how arrogance fell and integrity rose would be told in law schools and firms for years to come. But the real legacy wasn't in the dramatic revelation or the fall of the mighty. It was in the daily choice to build success on a foundation of respect, ethics, and genuine excellence. Katherine had once mocked me for not understanding success. In the end, she and her colleagues were the ones who had never understood what real success meant. The transformation of Morton Pierce into Summit Legal Partners wasn't just a change of names or ownership. It was proof that the greatest power lies not in making others feel small, but in creating something that makes everyone better. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.